Not that kind of chipping. This kind. In this video, I'll show you how I did dark chipping and rust effects on our Egyptian T34 122 model. And it's all coming up right after this. Hello everybody, welcome back. Hope you're all doing well and getting some modeling done. Well, let's get right into it with some dark chipping. As you can see, this is the way I remove the paint before I put it on the model, and this is the pattern you kind of want for the chips before you actually put it onto the paint surface. It's hard to see here, but I'm always rotating the pattern of the sponge. You don't want to start imprinting the exact same pattern all over everything, then it looks too uniform and kind of odd. So best rule of thumb is to just kind of move the sponge around, change positions where you're letting it touch, and you should come up with some fairly realistic looking results. The amount of chipping I'm adding to this model is probably not what you want to do on every armored vehicle, because armored vehicles didn't necessarily see a long service life, so they may not get beaten up like this. But because, like I said in a previous video, this is kind of a hypothetical paint job because there's no photographs of this vehicle in service during the war, so I'm kind of taking the liberty and chipping the crap out of it because I want to show it to be a heavily worn vehicle used for a long period of time, and being in the desert, it's going to get a lot of wear and tear. I find after chipping with a sponge, I don't necessarily get the exact marks I'm really looking for, so I like to go back in with a moistened Q-tip in a little bit of water, and I just go in and I'll dab out some of the areas that I find look a little too odd or don't really fit, or just they're marks I'm not really looking to keep on the model. I find this is a really useful technique and can save you a lot of grief if you do make a mistake and you want to go back out and remove it. I've said this in previous videos before, to really make sure you know where you're adding your chips. Make sure they're in logical areas where crew members might walk, or along the sides of the vehicle where it might rub up against trees or bushes or buildings. And remember to reference photos, that will help you out as well. Once I refine things a little bit with the sponge, I go in with a brush and start adding a little more depth and detail to all those chips. I get the best results from using a number 1 or a 0 Winsor Newton SABLE brush with a good point on it. This allows you to load up the brush with a good amount of paint, and you won't have to constantly be going back to your paint reservoir to pick up paint. I used to use a 00 or a 000 for this type of painting in the past, but I just get frustrated because I'd always be going back to my paint reservoir to pick up more paint and load the brush. This way, you know, you get yourself a good, reliable, larger brush with a good point, and you can go a long way without constantly having to waste time going back into the paint pot. The next step involves more of a wash as opposed to a hard edge chipping. I'll go in and blend in some of the chips with a watered down version of the same color. Some of what I'm doing here may seem a little harsh at this point, but as I go along in this painting process, will get blended back or possibly disappear altogether. So in my opinion, it's better to go a little darker than you might think you need to go, or add that contrast now, because the upcoming weathering procedures may eliminate a lot of what you're doing at this point. So you're probably wondering why I would go through all this work just to eliminate what I'm doing. Well, in my opinion, again, it comes down to layering, and I've said that in lots of videos too. It's all about layering and your dark and your light. You always want to have dark against light, so I may eliminate some of the work I've done, but I'll probably improve it with all the work in the upcoming steps. I use a lot of washes to blend or unify the areas that I'm working on, and helps to give a worn or distressed look to the surfaces. And the color I'm using here again is the German Camo Black Brown, just watered down very heavily. I suppose this would be more of a filter than a wash because I'm trying to change or alter the color or the intensity of the surface. I'll be using this technique quite a bit in the next video coming up, where I'll be doing a lot of fading to the upper surfaces and all the horizontal planes of the vehicle. I have a video all about washes and filters, and I'll link that in the upper right hand corner if you want to go check that out after watching this video. You can also use the Q-tip to do a reverse process. Instead of removing, you can add color, as I'm doing here. I've dipped the Q-tip into the wash. This will also help add a worn look to the surface. This technique can also help emulate the look of crew members that may have walked over certain surfaces with muddy boots or boots that may have grease and grime on them. At this point, I thought some of the deeper details needed a little more emphasis, so I added a little more paint to the wash just to help deepen the shadows a bit. Time to go
old school.
That's right, we're gonna step back in time with some paint that would curl the nose hairs on a pig farmer.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning. Smells like victory.
You guys smell like you fell into a dung heap.
Kinda makes you homesick, don't it?
Alright, time to add some rust to our chips. I find this technique a lot of fun, and it really helps bring the chips to life and helps reinforce the worn through metal look. This is the first color of rust I add. It's the lighter shade. I will add a darker shade as well, then also add some pigments to the mix. I guess I should also mention, it might not be obvious, but these are enamel paints I'm using now. So these are thinned with enamel thinner and will be removed with clean thinner later in the process. Once the first layer is dried, I go back in and reinforce some areas again with the same color. You can add as many applications as you feel you need until you get the right look. The process used here is exactly the same as the process I used when working with the acrylic paints. Enamels are very much like oils in their translucency and adds a ton of depth and richness to those previous layers underneath. Yes, I unfortunately had the misfortune of finding out that this particular thinner is a little on the hot side and it likes to eat acrylic paint. Now I probably should have changed out the thinner at this point, but I'm a bit of a stubborn guy, and I persisted to use it, but as I found out, the thinner actually worked to my advantage, as you can see here. By changing up the way I was applying the paint and being a little more delicate with it, I was able to go in and do a lot of microchipping with the thinner itself. So I don't know if this would work on every acrylic paint, but it worked really well on these MIG paints. So there you go, you learn something from your mistakes sometimes. Now I know most of you are thinking, why would the enamel thinner eat through on the acrylics? Because it's not supposed to do that. Well, I wish I could give you a great scientific explanation for that, but I have no idea what happened and why it did that. But just be careful when you're using enamels over acrylics, or put a clear coat on if you're really, worried about the paint surface. I, on the other hand, don't use a lot of clear coats when I do my weathering, so I just like to go in and go for it. Once I get everything laid in, then I go back in with some clean thinner and start blending. So here's what I was talking about with the thinner eating through to the acrylic base. You can see I'm blending out the enamels with the thinner, but at the same time pulling in light around some of the chips just to make things stand out a little more and give things a little more definition. Now with all the rust tones established within the chips, I'll go back in next with some pigments added to the enamel base colors. And by doing this, this will allow me to be able to shift and move those colors around a lot easier without them being permanent on the model. So again, I'm going to start with the lightest pigment color first, and then work my way up to the darker tones. Another reason I'll add the pigments to my paint colors is the pigment in the paint itself will absorb other colors you put on it later on. For example, when you're doing oil stains or grease marks or grease stains, the pigment will act like real dirt and absorb that color, leaving realistic looking effects. Don't forget to blend after each step as well. The amount of detail you can add with this technique is quite evident here. As you can see, there's many layers of microchipping and wear that I've achieved using this process. Dare I say that it's a little risky using this technique, but again, in my opinion, if you don't try new things, you never learn. So don't be afraid to experiment and take yourself to areas that you think you would normally not go, because you never know what will happen and what you'll discover. That's right, it will be quite difficult to achieve this process if you add clear coats in between each layer, or a clear coat at the beginning. Possibly a clear coat at the beginning, but in my experience, I don't think you'd be able to achieve the same level of depth and layers that I can achieve doing it this way. Here I'm adding some staining and discoloration to some of the joints and deep crevices in the panel lines and around fenders and those kind of areas. This just helps to give a little more interest and breaks up some of the flat patterns and makes things look a little more interesting, in my opinion. Having had the opportunity to be trained as an artist, I feel that this has given me the ability to really explore different artistic techniques and apply them to my models, and therefore has allowed me to see this hobby as more of a artistic endeavor as opposed to just slapping some paint on a piece of plastic. That being said, I don't think you really need to have an artistic background or artistic abilities to achieve a lot of these effects. It really comes down to observing the work of others you admire and applying those techniques. Well, just build more models. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, hitting the bell notification, give me a thumbs up, and share this video with someone in this great modeling community. Stay tuned for more adventures of the Egyptian T-34-122 coming at you real soon. I'm out of here. Talk to you later. Bye-bye now.